Someone in your life may have already started the process of letting you go, and you've been calling it something else. Maybe you've called it a busy season, a rough patch, something temporary that will pass once life calms down. That's an understandable instinct because the alternative, sitting with the possibility that someone is quietly stepping back, is uncomfortable enough that most people reach for any other explanation first. Here's what makes this particularly hard to catch. People rarely announce that they're done with someone. There's no clean moment, no formal notice. Instead, there's a slow withdrawal that unfolds in small, deliberate stages, long before anyone ever says a word out loud. And because each stage looks small in isolation, it's easy to explain away one at a time, even as the pattern underneath keeps quietly building. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what to watch for. 3 specific signs. And the third one is the one most people read completely backwards, mistaking it for peace when it's often the opposite. Stay with me, because once you can see this clearly, you'll never mistake silence for resolution again. You've noticed the replies getting shorter. You just haven't let yourself call it what it is. There's a particular kind of decline that happens before anyone consciously decides to pull away. Researchers who study relational maintenance call this effort withdrawal, the gradual reduction in time, attention, and initiation someone puts into a connection, often happening below the level of conscious decision. The mind keeps conserving energy for the relationships it still feels invested in, and quietly reallocates it away from the ones it doesn't. This shows up first in conversation, because conversation tends to be the lowest effort form of connection, and therefore the first place effort gets pulled from. A text that used to come back with 3 follow-up questions now comes back with 1 short line. A call that used to run 20 minutes now wraps in 4. The warmth might technically still be there on the surface, but the engagement underneath has thinned considerably. Picture this. You used to send a message and get a paragraph in return. Details about their day, a question about yours, maybe a joke tucked in somewhere. Lately, the replies have flattened. Good, you? Nothing's technically wrong, but notice what's missing. The follow-up questions, the curiosity about your life, the things that used to arrive without ever being asked for. Now, you might be thinking, couldn't this just be a busy stretch, nothing more than circumstance? Sometimes, genuinely, yes, life gets full and effort can dip temporarily without meaning anything deeper. But here's the detail that separates a busy week from something else entirely. Temporary busyness tends to bounce back. The questions return. The initiation comes back once the noise settles down. Withdrawal, rooted in disengagement, doesn't bounce back. It stays flat, or it thins further with time. 1 short reply during a hard week means very little. A pattern of shrinking replies across weeks with no return to how things used to be means something else entirely. There's another layer worth naming because it's easy to overlook. Pay attention to who's initiating contact now compared to before. If you've quietly become the only one starting conversations, the one always reaching out first, that shift in who's carrying the relationship is often more telling than the length of any single reply. Of course, context always matters here. Some people are naturally less verbose, and brevity by itself proves nothing if it's always been their style. What matters is change relative to their own baseline, not comparison to some general idea of what a thoughtful reply should look like. The common mistake here is filling the gap yourself, sending longer messages to compensate for their shorter ones, assuming that more effort from your side will eventually restore the balance. Often, it does the opposite. It delays you from seeing the pattern clearly because you're too busy carrying the emotional labor for both people to notice the imbalance forming underneath. Shorter conversations are easy to explain away. Busy week, bad day. The next sign is harder to excuse because it isn't about words at all. You used to hear about the small stuff first. Now you hear about it last, or not at all. This second sign is quieter than the first, and in some ways harder to catch, because it doesn't live in what someone says. It lives in what they stop sharing. Psychologists studying emotional closeness point to something called disclosure patterns, the small, ongoing exchange of minor updates, plans, and details that make up most of the texture of any close relationship. It's rarely the big news that builds closeness. It's the accumulation of small things, what someone had for lunch, a minor frustration at work, a passing thought about the weekend ahead. When someone begins emotionally disengaging from a relationship, this small-scale sharing is usually the first content to disappear, even while bigger updates might still get passed along eventually, almost as a formality. The reasoning behind it isn't usually conscious or calculated. It's closer to instinct. Once someone stops feeling like a relationship is a source of ongoing emotional nourishment, the mind stops automatically routing small thoughts toward that person the way it once did. Think about a sibling, a close friend, a parent, someone who used to be your first call with small news. You got a new job, and they heard about it within the hour. Now you mention something significant, and you realize partway through that they're hearing it for the first time, days or weeks later, sometimes secondhand from someone else entirely. That gap between when something happened and when they found out tends to widen the more someone has emotionally stepped back. This shows up just as clearly in invitations. You used to be the first text when plans were forming, dinner, a weekend trip, even something as small as a casual hangout. Lately, you're finding out after the fact, almost as an afterthought, or not finding out at all. The plans didn't necessarily stop. You simply stopped being part of how they're made. You might be thinking, couldn't this just be circumstance? Different schedules, different priorities, nothing personal? Sometimes, genuinely, yes. People's lives shift, and inclusion naturally redistributes as circumstances change. But the qualifier that matters here is consistency across multiple categories. If you're being left out of small updates, small invitations, and small check-ins all at once, rather than just one category in isolation, the explanation of circumstance becomes much harder to sustain. There is an objection worth addressing directly here, because it's a common one. Maybe you're thinking, perhaps they just assume I'm too busy to care about the small stuff, and that's why they don't share it. That's possible, and it does happen. But notice whether they've ever actually asked you that, or whether they've simply decided it on your behalf without checking. People who are still invested tend to ask. People who've started to disengage tend to assume, because asking would require an effort they're no longer making. The common mistake here is interpreting exclusion as your own failure to insert yourself enough, overcorrecting by forcing your way into every plan and every update. That rarely repairs anything. It often accelerates the very withdrawal you're trying to counteract because it adds pressure to a dynamic that's already quietly thinning out. Being left out of the small things tells you something is changing. What happens next tells you they've already decided how this ends. You thought the arguing stopping meant things were finally okay. It usually means the opposite. This is the sign almost everyone gets backwards, and it deserves a slower, more careful look than the first two. Most people are taught to associate conflict with deterioration, and the absence of conflict with health. In many relationships, that's true. But there's a specific kind of silence that doesn't represent peace at all. It represents exit. Psychologists describe a pattern sometimes called relational disengagement, where someone stops investing energy in repair, not because the relationship improved, but because they've already emotionally concluded it. Conflict, uncomfortable as it is, usually signals that someone still cares enough about the outcome to fight for it. Arguing about something means it still matters enough to argue about. The moment someone stops arguing, not because the problem resolved, but because they've simply stopped caring whether it does, that absence is often a far more serious signal than the conflict ever was. This shows up in a specific, recognizable way. Think of a recurring issue that used to generate real friction, a pattern of being late, a habit of canceling plans, a recurring disagreement about something that mattered to both people. For a long stretch, it came up. There were conversations about it, frustration, maybe even real arguments. Then, at some point, it simply stopped coming up. Not because it improved. The same behavior is still happening. It's just that no one mentions it anymore. That stopping is rarely relief. It's resignation. Notice the texture of the relationship in this phase. Interactions might even feel smoother on the surface, fewer tense conversations, fewer hard moments. But underneath that smoothness, there's often a flatness that wasn't there before. The emotional temperature has dropped, not because problems got solved, but because someone has quietly stopped expecting them to be. Here's a detail worth sitting with. Repair attempts are, by their nature, an investment. Bringing something up, sitting through the discomfort of a hard conversation, pushing for things to get better, none of that is effortless. People only spend that kind of energy on relationships they still believe are worth shaping. When someone stops trying to fix things, it isn't usually because everything got fixed. It's because some part of them has already decided the outcome doesn't depend on trying anymore. Of course, this isn't universal, and the qualifier matters here as much as anywhere else in this video. Some relationships genuinely do settle into calmer patterns after real growth, where conflict decreases because both people changed, not because one person checked out. The way to tell the difference is to look at whether the underlying issue actually resolved, or whether it simply stopped being mentioned while staying exactly the same. Resolution looks like change. Disengagement looks like silence around something that never changed at all. This connects back to everything you've already seen in this video. The shrinking conversations, the disappearance from small updates. None of these signs exist in isolation. They tend to arrive together, each one quietly reinforcing the others, building toward the same conclusion from different directions. The common mistake here is mistaking the absence of friction for the presence of health, relaxing into a false sense that things have improved, when what's actually happened is that someone has stopped expecting things to get better at all. Once you can see this one, you'll understand why the quietest version of someone leaving is usually the most final. So here's what ties these three signs together. People rarely leave with an announcement. They leave through a series of small withdrawals, each one easy to explain away on its own, until the pattern they form together becomes impossible to deny. You don't need to treat every short reply or quiet week as proof that someone's gone. That's not the goal, and reading too much into a single moment will only exhaust you. The goal is simply to notice the pattern when it's actually there, instead of explaining each piece away in isolation the way most people do. I want to hear from you on this one. Which of these three signs have you already seen in someone close to you? And which one did you talk yourself out of believing? I read every comment, and on this channel, we look closely at the quiet parts of human connection most people walk past without understanding. If that's useful to you, staying subscribed means you won't miss what's next. Next time, I'll show you the one thing you can do in the early stages of these signs that actually changes the outcome before the door closes for good.